At my son's engagement gala, in front of 300 guests, the woman he was about to marry reached out and tore the wig from my wife's head. Lorraine's bare scalp, pale and scarred by months of chemotherapy, caught the full glare of the chandeliers. For one long, terrible second, the ballroom held its breath. Then, from a table near the stage, I heard something far worse than any gasp. I heard laughter. I did not shout. I did not throw a glass, or curse, or lunge across the room. I had learned across a long life that a quiet man is far more frightening than a loud one. So I rose from my chair, crossed the polished floor, and laid a single white envelope on the closed lid of the piano. Then I looked into that young woman's triumphant eyes and asked her very gently to open it. She had no idea what she was holding. None of them did. What that beautiful, cruel bride did not know was that I had spent 50 years of my life learning to tell what is real from what is counterfeit, and that the gleaming heirloom on that stage, the one she was so proud of, was about to expose every lie the two of them had ever told. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand how a 72-year-old man came to detonate his own son's wedding, you have to go back 6 months, to a quieter and far more ordinary kind of heartbreak. My name is Everett Calloway. For half a century, I have made my living in a narrow brick workshop in the River Arts District of Asheville, North Carolina, restoring old pianos and authenticating rare instruments for auction houses up and down the East Coast. It is a strange trade and a lonely one. People carry in a battered concert grand or a violin wrapped in an old bedsheet, and I press my ear to the wood, the way a physician presses a stethoscope to a chest. I can hear a repair a man tried to hide beneath fresh varnish. I can feel a forged maker's mark under my thumb the way other people can see one. My whole life has been the slow, unglamorous work of separating the genuine article from the clever fake. I never once imagined that this quiet skill would become the only weapon I had left. For 40 of those years, the finest thing in my life was not any instrument at all. It was Lorraine. She was a piano teacher when I met her, with a laugh that filled a room and hands that could draw mercy out of the coldest keyboard. On the day we married, I gave her the one treasure I owned, a century-old concert grand I had restored with my own hands, its soundboard signed and dated in a hidden place only I knew. We built a life around that piano, in a tall old house on a hill, a house full of music and stairs. And then 2 years ago, the doctors found the lymphoma. The treatments were merciless. The chemotherapy took her hair first, then her strength. And on the darkest evenings, it seemed to reach for her spirit as well. I sold the greater part of my share in the workshop and stepped away from the auction circuit for one reason only: to be at her side. The tall old house we had loved for so long slowly became our enemy. The staircase she had climbed 10,000 times turned into a mountain her frail body could no longer manage. She needed a home on a single level, and she needed it close to the oncology center downtown, where every week she went to fight for a little more time. So I set out to find one. 6 months before the gala that would tear my family apart, I did. It was a spacious ground-floor place, only 10 minutes from the hospital, with wide doorways and a small walled garden she could see from her bed. It was exactly right. But Lorraine could not be left alone for long, and I would not leave her. So when my son Preston offered to handle the purchase on my behalf, I was grateful. Preston was 34 then, a smooth young man who called himself an investment consultant, with costly shoes and an easy, practiced smile. I had paid for his education. I had trusted him his entire life. So I signed the papers, granting him the authority to close the deal, and I wrote a cashier's check for the full down payment and every closing cost, and I placed it into his hand, believing I had lifted a heavy weight from my shoulders. I should have known better. I, of all men, should have understood that the most convincing forgery in the world is the one you desperately want to believe. 3 days later, on a crisp Tuesday morning, I drove downtown to my bank, meaning only to confirm that the money had reached the escrow account, so that I might surprise Lorraine with the keys that very weekend. The branch manager, a woman who had handled my accounts for years, pulled the record, frowned, and quietly adjusted her glasses. Then she slid a single printout across the marble counter toward me. And when my eyes fell to the numbers at the bottom of that page, the blood in my veins turned to ice. You do not survive 50 years of authenticating other people's treasures without learning to read a document the way a hawk reads a field. My eyes went first, out of long habit, to the endorsement line on the back of the scanned check. And there, printed in cold black ink, was a name that did not belong to any title company, any escrow account, or any closing attorney. The $150,000 I had written for my dying wife's home had been deposited in full into the corporate account of a luxury European motor cars gallery on the far side of town. I stood very still in the quiet lobby of that bank. Around me, tellers counted bills, and a printer hummed, and somewhere a child asked his mother for a lollipop. And none of them knew that the floor had just dropped out from under an old man's world. My first instinct, the instinct of any father, was to invent an excuse for my son. A clerical error, a mistyped routing number, a mix-up between two accounts. But numbers do not lie. They have never once lied to me in half a century. The routing codes were clean, the amount was exact, and the funds had cleared the previous afternoon. The money meant to carry Lorraine safely down from a staircase she could no longer climb had been spent. Every last dollar of it on something that gleamed. I thanked the manager in a voice that sounded, even to my own ears, strangely calm. I folded the printout into a neat rectangle and slid it into the inner pocket of my coat over my heart, the way I have always carried the papers that matter. Then I walked out into the bright autumn morning and sat behind the wheel of my car for a long time without turning the key. I did not weep. I was too busy remembering. 9 days earlier, Preston had come to the house with his head bowed and his voice heavy with apology. Lorraine needed a special adjustable bed, one that could lift her gently through the night so the fluid would not pool in her chest while she slept. It cost a little under $4,000. I had asked him to arrange it, and he had promised he would. And then, the very next evening, he had telephoned me, tense and full of regret, to say the family accounts were briefly tied up in a slow-moving transaction, and he simply could not release the payment yet. He had asked me to be patient. He had told me that money just now was tight. What made that memory unbearable was not the money. It was Lorraine herself. When I had gently raised the subject of the new bed, she had reached for my hand and told me not to make a fuss, that she did not want to be a burden, that the old bed was perfectly fine. She had spent her whole life refusing to take up more room than she needed. She was a woman who apologized to the nurses for the trouble of her own illness. And her son, who had watched her fold herself smaller and smaller, so as not to inconvenience anyone, had looked me in the eye and pleaded poverty. Money was tight. And here on a printout folded against my heart was proof that during that very same week, my son had signed away a small fortune to a dealership that sold automobiles costing more than the house I had raised him in. A colder man might have called the police from the parking lot. A weaker one might have driven straight home to grieve. I did neither. I sat there gripping the wheel until my knuckles paled, and I let a single, terrible question take shape in my mind. If the money for Lorraine's home had gone to buy a machine of chrome and leather, then who exactly was driving it, and what else had my son quietly rearranged while I sat at his mother's bedside? There was a name I already suspected: Sloane Merrick, the young woman Preston intended to marry. I had met Sloane perhaps a dozen times, and each time she had studied our family the way a jeweler studies a stranger's ring, appraising, calculating, deciding in an instant whether we were worth her attention. She called herself a heritage and fine art consultant, which, as far as I could ever tell, meant she attended a great many parties and photographed a great many expensive things. She spoke constantly of image, of branding, of the sort of people one simply had to be seen among. I had always tried to look past it, because Preston swore he loved her, and a father wants more than almost anything to believe his son has chosen well. But I was no longer a father looking past a girl's small vanities. I was an auditor who had just found a hole in the ledger, and I meant to trace it all the way down to the bottom. I started the engine at last. My hands, I noticed, with a strange detachment, were perfectly steady. That steadiness had carried me through 4 decades of tense negotiations across auction floors, where a single trembling finger could cost a man his fortune. It would carry me now. I did not turn toward home, toward the tall house on the hill where a nurse sat with my wife. Instead, I pointed the car north, toward the manicured lawns and wide paved driveways of the neighborhood where my son lived with his bride-to-be. The drive should have taken 20 minutes. That morning, it felt like a slow descent into a country I no longer recognized. Mile after mile of tidy hedges and gleaming mailboxes, each one hiding a family with its own quiet secrets. As I drove, the pieces began to arrange themselves the way fragments of a shattered instrument arrange themselves on my workbench before I understand what I am even looking at. The tightness of money, the bowed head, the $4,000 my son could not find for his mother. And now this. I was not simply going to visit Preston. I was going to walk uninvited into whatever he had been building behind my back. I told myself I would stay calm. I told myself there might yet be some explanation I had not imagined, some innocent thread that would tie all of this back into the ordinary shape of family. I am ashamed now of how badly I wanted to believe that. I slowed the car a few houses short of their address and eased it to the curb beneath a row of red maples just beginning to turn. From there I could see their long, pale driveway through my windshield, and what stood upon it gleaming under the October sun, with the temporary dealer plate still fixed to its back, took whatever fragile hope I had carried out of that bank and crushed it silently in the palm of my hand. It was an automobile, of course, a brand new sport utility vehicle, pearl white and enormous, its flanks catching the morning light like polished bone. The temporary dealer plates were still taped in the rear window. It sat in the center of that pale driveway, the way a trophy sits on a mantel, angled just so, meant to be seen and envied. And standing before it, phone raised high above her head, was Sloane Merrick. She wore designer sunglasses and a fitted cream coat, and she was quite literally dancing. She circled the vehicle in slow, deliberate steps, tilting her chin, arching one shoulder, pressing her back against the gleaming door, and pouting at the little glowing screen in her hand. She was photographing herself from every angle, over and over, the way a person does when they intend to show the entire world exactly how far they have risen. I could not hear her, but I did not need to. I have spent my life reading faces across crowded auction rooms, and hers was radiant with the particular joy of someone who believes she has finally gotten away with it. I sat in my car 100 feet away and watched a woman celebrate on the exact spot where my wife's safety had been buried. The money meant to spare Lorraine a single painful morning on the stairs was now reflecting the October sun off a slab of imported steel. While my wife sat in a recliner, too weak to walk to her own bedroom, this young woman was arranging her hair for one more photograph, curating a portrait of wealth and ease to scatter across the internet. Every flash of that screen felt like a small, deliberate insult aimed straight at the woman I loved. For a long moment I could not move. I have handled priceless things in my life, instruments worth more than most homes, and I have never once let my hands shake. They did not shake now. But something behind my ribs, something I had carried carefully for 72 years, went very cold and very quiet, the way a room goes quiet, before the last note of a requiem fades. I thought of all the years I had spent building a safe world for the people I loved. The 18-hour days in the workshop, the auctions I had flown to, and the holidays I had missed. The endless, patient labor of a man who wanted only to make certain that his family would never lie awake at night, listening to the sound of an empty bank account. I thought, too, of a much smaller memory, one I had not touched in years. Preston, at 7 years old, perched on the bench beside me in the workshop, watching me tune the very piano I would one day give his mother. He had asked me how I could hear when a note was true, and I had told him that if you listen closely enough, an honest sound has nothing to hide. He had nodded very seriously, the way small boys do, and pressed his little ear to the wood just as I did. I had believed in that moment that I was raising an honest man. I had handed that grown man a check with the whole trusting heart of a father, and he had taken it and turned it into a thing to park in a driveway and photograph. Then I noticed something that turned my cold silence into something harder. She was not merely taking pictures. She had propped the phone on the hood and stepped back, and now she was speaking to it, gesturing, filming herself in the deliberate way people do when they are recording a little speech. A reveal, I realized. She was announcing this machine to her audience as though it were an achievement, a milestone, a reward she had earned through her own cleverness and grace. I would learn later exactly what she told them. For now, it was enough to watch her lips move and understand that she felt no fear at all. She had no idea that the quiet old man she had always dismissed was sitting 100 feet away with the proof of her theft folded against his heart. That was the moment I stopped grieving. Grief is a soft thing. It bends you. It empties you. It makes you want to lie down. What rose in me now was not soft at all. I was no longer only a frightened husband watching his wife slip away. I was a man who had been robbed, calmly and deliberately, by the two people who should have been guarding her most fiercely. And a man who has been robbed does not weep in his car. He counts, he plans, he waits. Every instinct I had, sharpened over 50 years of appraisal, was awake now. And they were all telling me the same thing. If I stormed up that driveway, shouting, if I waved the printout in their faces and demanded my money back, I would learn almost nothing. They would apologize. They would produce some polished explanation. They would smooth it over, return a portion of the money to quiet me, and I would spend the rest of my days never knowing how deep the rot actually ran. And I was certain, with the same certainty that tells me a signature is false, that this driveway was not the bottom of it. A boy who lies to his father about a $4,000 bed does not stop at a single automobile. No. If I wanted the truth, the whole truth, I would have to let them believe they had won. I would have to become, for a little while, exactly the foolish, trusting, broken old man they already imagined me to be. I would have to let them keep digging, calmly and confidently, until the hole they were standing in was too deep to climb out of. So I made myself a promise there beneath the red maples. I would not raise my voice today. I would not accuse. I would give them all the rope they wanted, and I would watch, and I would remember every single word. I looked down at my hands one last time. Steady. Not the stillness of a calm man I understood now, but the stillness of a blade before it falls. Good. I drew a slow breath, opened the door, and stepped out onto the quiet, tree-lined street. The autumn air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke and dying leaves. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and fell silent. I closed the car door with a single, solid thud, the sound carrying farther than I intended in the still morning, and I began to walk, unhurried and calm, up the long, pale driveway toward the woman who had just celebrated the theft of my wife's last comfort. It was Preston who saw me first. He stepped out of the open garage, wiping his hands on a spotless white towel, dressed in a soft weekend sweater that had surely cost more than my first workbench. He wore the easy, relaxed smile of a man at the top of his little world, and that smile died the instant his eyes found mine walking toward him. His shoulders went rigid. The towel stopped moving in his hands. I did not hurry. I have learned that a slow, quiet approach unsettles a guilty man far more than any shout. I stopped a few feet from my son and said nothing at all. Sloane finally lowered her phone, her expression sliding from mild annoyance into a bright, practiced surprise. Behind them, the white machine gleamed. I reached into my coat, drew out the folded printout, and held it toward Preston. I did not speak. I simply waited. He hesitated, then took it. I watched his eyes travel down the page, over the routing numbers, over the endorsements stamped in the name of the motorcar's gallery. And I watched the color drain slowly from his face. He swallowed hard. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked at the edges. "Dad," he said, "I can explain this. It isn't what it looks like." I kept my hands in my pockets and my voice perfectly level. I told him it looked exactly like what it was. It looked like $150,000 meant to buy a safe home for his dying mother, handed over to a car dealer. Then I asked him very calmly to make it make sense. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, and I saw the panic in his eyes harden into something rehearsed. When he spoke again, the tremor was gone, replaced by the smooth, confident cadence I imagine he used in his meetings. The condo had fallen through, he said. During the final title search, the closing company had discovered a large hidden lien on the property, left behind by a previous owner. It was a legal nightmare in the making. If he had left my money sitting in that escrow account, it could have been frozen in litigation for years. So he had pulled the funds out at once to protect my cash. He handed the paper back to me as though the matter were already settled. It was a beautiful lie. It used the right words, it flattered my caution, and it painted him as the hero who had rescued my money from disaster. But a lien on a house does not require a man to endorse a cashier's check to an automobile showroom. And I let him keep talking, because a liar always builds one bridge too many. Right at that moment, he went on. Warming to it, Sloane had received the call of her life. She had landed a major position with a prestigious firm that advised on multi-million-dollar art and estate collections. In that world, he explained, appearance was everything. You could not pull up to a client's private gallery in a battered sedan and expect to be trusted with a Rembrandt. She had needed, in his words, a closer's car. On cue, Sloane stepped away from the vehicle and drifted toward us, and the woman filming her little triumph vanished entirely. In her place stood a soft, wounded, devoted daughter-in-law. Her eyes glistened. She wiped away a tear that had not been there a second before. "Everett," she said, using my first name in a low, trembling voice. "I am so sorry we didn't call you first. Everything happened so fast. I never wanted to touch your money. Preston insisted it was an investment in our family's future." An investment, I repeated, without any color in the word. "Yes," Preston said quickly. Her first commission would be enormous, well over $200,000. He would return my entire $150,000 with interest, and then they would find an even better home for his mother, one with a private garden. They had only needed to borrow against the cash for 30 days to launch her new career. Sloane reached out and laid her manicured hand upon my arm. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes and told me she was grinding herself to the bone for this family. She swore she wanted to land these great accounts for one reason only, so she could pay for Lorraine's experimental treatments, so she could send her to a specialized clinic she had read about. She loved her like her own mother, she said. She was doing all of this for her. Then, as though remembering a line in a play, she turned and lifted a canvas tote from the hood of the car. She reached inside and drew out a large stainless steel thermos, warm enough that I could feel the heat when she pressed it into my hands. "I woke at 5 o'clock this morning to make this," she said. "It's a herbal tonic, an old family recipe, full of natural antioxidants to help her get her strength back. I was just about to drive it to the hospital. Please take it to her. Tell her I am praying for her every single hour." I held the warm thermos. I looked at it, then at the gleaming car, then at my son, who was standing tall now, with the glowing satisfaction of a man certain he had just talked an old fool into peace. 1,000 alarms were ringing in the back of my mind. I knew that pulling funds from a real escrow account requires a signed release I had never been asked to sign. I knew that these automobiles lose a fifth of their worth the moment they leave the lot, which makes them the very worst place to park money you intend to return in 30 days. I knew they were lying to me with every breath. But I also knew that if I exploded now, I would learn nothing more than I already had. So I let the muscles of my face go slack. I let my shoulders sag into the posture of a tired, overwhelmed old husband, grateful only that someone else was handling things. I told Preston with a weary sigh that I understood that I was simply frightened for his mother, that her latest results had been terrible, and I had panicked. I told him I should have trusted him. He smiled, the tension melting from his frame, and told me not to worry about a thing. I nodded, offered Sloane a small, grateful nod for the thermos, and turned to make the slow walk back to my car, playing the relieved father to the very end. And as I reached for the door handle and glanced once into the side mirror, I saw my son do something that stopped the breath in my chest. He had reached into his pocket, and the phone in his hand was not the sleek silver one he always carried. It was cheap and black and unfamiliar. I did not pull away at once. I sat with the engine idling and my eyes fixed on the small rectangle of the side mirror, because a man who has spent his life examining objects knows that the truth is almost always in the detail you were not meant to see. Sloane had already turned her back on me. She was drifting toward the driver's side of the white machine. Phone lifted again, sliding effortlessly back into her private commercial for an audience of strangers. But Preston was not looking at his bride. He was looking over his shoulder down the quiet street, checking to be certain my car was truly leaving. Satisfied that I was, he bent his head over the cheap black phone and his thumbs began to fly. Even from that distance, I could read the frantic energy in his hands. He was not sending a message. He was pushing buttons in quick jabbing bursts, opening menus, deleting things, the way a man empties his pockets when he hears the sirens coming. The calm, polished consultant of 2 minutes ago, the one who had rescued my money from a phantom lien, was gone. In his place stood a frightened boy, scrubbing something away as fast as his fingers could manage. I have handled a great many forgeries in my time. I know the look of a man erasing his own tracks. A legitimate advisor who manages a family's finances does not carry a second telephone, cheap and untraceable, the kind you buy with cash at a gas station and throw in a river. And he most certainly does not stand in his own driveway, frantically wiping its memory clean the moment his father catches him with a stolen check. Whatever Preston was hiding, it was not a mistake. And it was not a car. It was something he was terrified to have found on the device he actually carried in his hand. I eased my foot onto the accelerator and pulled slowly from the curb, keeping my speed gentle and unremarkable. A tired old man driving home. In the mirror, the two of them grew smaller, she posing, he hunched over his secret, until the red maples swallowed them from view. The thermos sat on the passenger seat beside me, still faintly warm, its polished steel catching the light at every turn. I drove without any particular destination, letting the streets carry me while my mind worked. When a disputed instrument arrives at my bench, I do not begin with whether it looks genuine. Anyone can be fooled by a thing that looks genuine. I begin instead by building its provenance, laying every documented moment of its life end to end. This sale, that repair, this owner, that auction, until the chain either holds together without a gap or reveals the single link where the story quietly breaks. A forger can imitate a varnish, He can copy a signature stroke for stroke. What he can almost never do is invent a history that survives being laid out in order. So I laid my son's history out, in order, there behind the wheel, event by event. He had stolen a fortune meant for his mother. He had lied to my face, with a fluency that frightened me more than the theft itself. And now, he was destroying evidence on a phone designed to leave no trace. 3 separate things, and yet I could feel the way you feel, a hairline crack running beneath the surface of a soundboard, that they were not 3 things at all. They were one thing, and I had only found its edges. Somewhere there was a link I had not yet seen, the place where the whole polished story broke, and every instinct I owned told me it was closer to Lorraine than to any automobile. For a moment, I let myself imagine the innocent version. Perhaps the burner was some foolish business scheme, a tax dodge, a gambling debt, the ordinary, shabby secret of a man living beyond his means. Perhaps it had nothing to do with my wife at all. I wanted that to be true with an intensity that shamed me, the same way I had wanted the bank to be wrong that very morning. All my life, I have prided myself on seeing clearly. And here I was, an old man begging his own eyes to lie to him a little longer. But I no longer trusted the things I wanted to be true. I came to a red light and stopped. And as I sat there, idling, in the ordinary traffic of an ordinary Tuesday, my gaze fell on the thermos. Sloane had woken at 5 o'clock, she said, to brew that tonic with her own hands. She had pressed it on me, with tears in her eyes, and a promise to pray for my wife every hour. It was she wanted me to believe, the single, selfless gesture in a morning otherwise built on greed. A devoted daughter-in-law, caring for the dying mother she loved as her own. And yet, a cold thought moved through me, slow and quiet, the way cold water finds the lowest place in a room. I thought of how strange it was that the 2 of them, who could not spare $4,000 for a bed to ease Lorraine's nights, could always spare an hour each morning to prepare her a special drink. I thought of how insistent Sloane had been that I carry it to the hospital myself today, without delay, as though its arrival were a matter of some schedule I could not see. I thought of the burner phone and the deleted messages, and a plan careful enough to require a shadow. I did not yet have a name for the fear taking shape in me. I only knew that the smiling girl in the driveway had handed a warm cup to a dying woman every single morning for weeks, and that I had never once thought to ask what was in it. And here is the thing that kept my hands steady even as that fear rose. A suspicion is not a proof. I have watched fortunes ruined and reputations burned to the ground because a confident man mistook his own certainty for evidence. If I walked into that hospital and accused my son's bride of harming my wife with nothing but a bad feeling and a warm thermos, I would achieve exactly one thing. I would warn her. She would smile and weep and pour the tonic quietly down a drain, and I would never again get close enough to prove a single word. Whatever this was, I would have to meet it the way I met every disputed piece that ever crossed my bench. Not with anger. With a test. The light turned green. I did not drive toward home. I turned the wheel toward the oncology center downtown, where my wife lay waiting, and I placed one steady hand on the lid of the thermos, as though it were something that might, at any moment, come awake. The oncology center had always been for me a place I steeled myself against the sterile smell of it, the soft hum of the machines, the particular quiet of a floor where people fight for time. That afternoon, I noticed none of it. I carried the thermos through the sliding glass doors and rode the elevator to the 4th floor with my whole attention fixed on the warm steel in my hands. When I stepped into Lorraine's room, the sight of her nearly took my legs from under me. I need you to understand something. Only 3 weeks earlier, her doctor had been cautiously, carefully hopeful. Her blood counts had begun to steady. She had walked the length of the corridor on her own, one hand trailing the rail, and she had laughed about beating me in a race. And then, over those same 3 weeks, without any explanation anyone could give me, she had simply fallen away. She looked smaller now than she had that very morning. Her skin was pale and paper-thin across her cheekbones. She was sleeping, and her breath came in shallow, effortful little pulls. I set the thermos on the rolling table beside her bed and lowered myself into the chair. I took her thin hand in mine and felt the delicate architecture of the bones beneath the skin. She stirred and opened her tired eyes and gave me the smallest, bravest smile I have ever been given. I asked her how she felt. She told me in a whisper that the sickness was worse today, a deep nausea that seemed to rise out of her very bones. She had not been able to hold down solid food since the afternoon before. She said it almost apologetically, as though her own body were an inconvenience she was sorry to trouble me with. Then, because she could see the fear I was trying to hide, she did the thing she has always done when a room grows too heavy. She hummed. Just a few low notes. The opening of an old song she used to play on our piano on Sunday evenings. Thin and unsteady now, but unmistakable. In 40 years of marriage, she has answered grief with melody more times than I can count. And hearing her reach for it, there in that narrow bed, with a needle taped to the back of her hand, was almost more than I could bear. I looked at the thermos on the table. The devoted daughter-in-law played again in my memory, the tears, the tote bag, the promise to pray. I unscrewed the lid. A thick steam rose from the dark liquid inside, and it did not smell like any broth or tea I had ever known. It carried a sharp, bitter, almost medicinal edge that turned my stomach on the spot. I tilted the thermos and poured a little into a plastic hospital cup. The liquid was murky, and small crushed leaves and dark shreds of root rose and turned slowly on its surface. I have a careful nose. It is part of the trade. Old glue, scorched felt, the particular mustiness of a soundboard that has spent a decade in a damp basement. I can name them all, with my eyes closed. And this was not the honest green smell of chamomile or ginger or any grandmother's kitchen remedy. Underneath the herbs was something else, something with a chemical spine to it. The faint sharpness you catch in a chemist's shop, rather than a garden. Lorraine's face contracted at the sight of it. She told me softly that the tonic always seemed to make her feel worse, not better. But she drank it, she said, because Sloane went to such trouble each morning, and she did not want to seem ungrateful to the young woman her son was going to marry. She said it the way she said everything now, gently, without complaint, folding her own suffering into a smaller and smaller shape, so that no one else would have to look at it. My chest tightened until I could barely draw a breath, because there it was the link I had felt but could not see on the drive over. I laid it out one more time the way I lay out a provenance, and this time the chain did not break. It closed. 3 weeks ago, cautious hope. 3 weeks ago, Sloane had begun arriving each morning with a warm thermos and a loving smile. And in those same 3 weeks, my wife had come undone, sickened, and shrunk toward death, while a room full of good doctors stood baffled at her bedside. The timeline was too clean. In 50 years of tracing the histories of objects, I have learned to distrust a story that fits together too perfectly. Because forgery, real forgery, is always a little too neat. Illness is messy. It advances and retreats. It surprises the experts. It does not keep an appointment. But this decline had kept an appointment every single morning at whatever hour Sloane chose to appear. These were not the acts of frightened, grieving young people who had panicked and spent some money on a car. A theft I could almost have forgiven in time. This was something else. This was a schedule. Every muscle in me wanted to stand up, walk out of that hospital, drive back across town, and take Sloane Merrick by the collar. I did not move. I have made my worst mistakes in life at the exact moments my heart was loudest, and my heart was screaming now. So I held it still, the way I hold my hands still over a fragile joint. And I reminded myself of the only rule that mattered. Not anger. A test. If I was wrong, I owed that girl an apology. I would spend the rest of my days making. And if I was right, I would need proof no lawyer and no jury could ever wave away. I did not let any of it reach my face. I reached over and gently pressed the lid back onto the thermos and sealed it tight. I told Lorraine she did not have to drink it today, not one drop. I told her I would go down to the cafeteria myself and bring her some plain tea and a little toast, something kind to her stomach. I watched the relief soften her features as she let her eyes fall closed and sank back into the pillows. I kissed her forehead. Her skin was cool and dry beneath my lips. I told her I would only be a few minutes. Then I picked up the thermos and I stepped out into the bright, bustling corridor. And I did not go to the cafeteria. I turned instead toward the bank of staff elevators at the far end of the hall, the thermos held carefully against my side like something I did not want to spill. And I rode down toward the research wing to find the one person in that building who could tell me, without question and without mercy, exactly what my son's bride had been pouring into my wife. Dr. Ingrid Sorensen was not only the oncologist managing my wife's case, she was a friend of more than 20 years, a woman I had trusted with the most fragile thing in my life. I found her in her office with a stack of charts, and she looked up startled to see me there, outside of any scheduled visit. I set the thermos on her desk. I did not waste time softening it. I told her I needed a favor, a large one, off the record, and I needed it done quietly, and now. I asked her to run whatever she could, a toxicology screen, a spectrometry test, anything on the liquid inside that steel container. She frowned and looked from the thermos to my face. She asked gently whether I had some reason to fear the food was spoiled or tampered with somehow. I told her I suspected something a great deal worse than a spoiled batch of soup, but that I needed science before I tore my own family to pieces. She studied me for a long moment. And because Ingrid knew my character, because she had watched me stay calm through 2 decades of hard news and had never once seen me indulge in panic or fancy, she did not press me further. She stood, picked up the thermos, and carried it down the hall toward the laboratory herself. It was Ingrid who had first found the shadow on Lorraine's scan 2 years before. Ingrid who had sat with us both in a small consultation room and delivered the worst sentence of our lives without once looking away. She had earned the right to my trust the hard way, and she was spending none of it now on false comfort. She simply took the thermos and went. Then came the waiting. I have waited for many verdicts in my life. I have stood in silent rooms while experts decided whether an instrument I had staked my reputation on was genuine or a ruin. None of it prepared me for that hallway. I paced its length back and forth, past the humming vending machines and the framed prints of mountains, while every minute stretched into something unbearable. I thought of Lorraine upstairs humming her Sunday song into the thin hospital air. I thought of Preston, the boy who had once pressed his ear to a piano to hear whether a note was honest, now standing in a driveway, deleting his sins. The anger in me was changing its shape. It was cooling and hardening into something with edges. Twice I stopped and told myself I was a foolish old man letting grief run away with him, that the test would come back clean and I would laugh at my own dark imagination. I wanted that verdict so badly I could taste it. But somewhere beneath the wanting, in the same cold place that had read the endorsement on that check, I already knew what the laboratory was going to say. 45 minutes later, the laboratory doors opened and Ingrid came out, and I knew before she spoke a single word. The color was gone from her face. She did not invite me back into her office. She drew me instead into a quiet alcove away from the passing nurses, and she put a printed report into my hands, and her own hands, I noticed, were not quite steady. She looked me directly in the eye and asked me very quietly exactly who had been giving this to my wife. I told her it was Sloane, my son's bride. She lowered her voice until it was barely more than breath. The tonic, she said, was not any harmless herbal remedy. It had been loaded with a heavy, concentrated dose of a common botanical extract, one sold on ordinary shelves. One that most people think of as gentle and natural. And that, she said, was precisely the horror of it. She explained it to me plainly, the way you explain a thing to a man who needs to understand it completely. In small amounts, the extract was nothing, but in the concentration someone had built into that thermos, it became a powerful driver of the liver, forcing the body to break down and flush away other compounds far faster than it should. And the compounds it flushed away most efficiently were the very drugs keeping Lorraine alive. The chemotherapy she endured each week, the poison she accepted willingly, in the hope of a few more years, was being stripped out of her blood before it could ever reach the disease. The tonic was not fighting her cancer. It was quietly disarming the only thing that could. I stood very still while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the words settled into me, one by one. Her decline had not been a mystery. It had not been the natural, cruel progress of the illness. Every morning, with a loving smile and a promise to pray, Sloane had handed my wife a warm cup that undid an entire week of medicine that made her violently ill, that let the cancer spread unchallenged, while a floor full of doctors searched for a cause that was sitting in a steel thermos the whole time. This was not neglect. It was not some misguided faith in natural cures. Ingrid was gentle with the word, but she did not shy from it. This was deliberate. Somebody had built that decline on purpose, dose by dose, morning by morning. The hallway seemed to tilt beneath me. I put one hand against the cool wall to steady myself, and in that moment I understood the full and terrible shape of it. Sloane did not merely want my money. She wanted Lorraine gone, and gone soon, before some wedding, before some deadline I could not yet see. My wife was not a bystander to their greed. She was an obstacle they had decided to remove. I was no longer dealing with a vain, grasping young woman who had stolen a car. I was dealing with someone patient enough and cold enough to murder a dying woman one gentle cup at a time, and to smile while she did it. I thanked Ingrid. I asked her to keep the report and to tell no one yet. She gripped my arm and told me to be careful, and I heard in her voice that she was frightened for me. I folded the copy she gave me and placed it in my coat beside the printout from the bank. 2 documents now resting over my heart. Whatever softness had still lived in me, whatever last thread of hope that this was all some dreadful misunderstanding, was gone. In its place was something quiet and absolute and cold. Now I was going to destroy her, and I was going to do it so completely that she would never see it coming. I went back up to the 4th floor with a cup of pale, lukewarm chamomile in my hand, and I set it gently on Lorraine's table while she slept. Then I carried the thermos into her small bathroom and poured the dark tonic down the sink, watching the murky liquid swirl and vanish. I rinsed the steel until it was spotless. The proof I needed was already folded over my heart. What remained in that container was simply poison, and I would not leave one drop of it within reach of my wife. I could have raged. I could have driven straight across town and dragged Sloane out of whatever showroom she was preening in. But rage is a luxury a man in my position cannot afford. Rage makes you loud and predictable and slow. I needed to be none of those things. I needed, above all, to be unpredictable. And so I did the one thing they would never expect. I said nothing at all. Instead, I walked to the nurses' station and asked to speak with the administrator. I did not tell them the whole story, because a formal investigation would reach Sloane long before I was ready. I used instead the one language every private hospital understands. I opened my checkbook. I arranged for 3 vetted private nurses to watch over my wife in rotating shifts around the clock. I gave a single, unbending instruction. No food or drink from outside this building would pass Lorraine's lips, and Sloane Merrick was not to enter that room unless I stood in it beside her. The staff agreed at once. For the first time in weeks, my wife was safe. Then I checked the time, and I began to plan the second thing I had come to do. I knew Preston and Sloane's schedule almost to the minute because Sloane broadcast it endlessly to the world. That very afternoon, they were across town at an exclusive venue tasting cakes and champagne for the lavish wedding I now understood was also a deadline. They would be gone for hours, distracted and unreachable. I drove to their quiet tree-lined street and parked 2 blocks away, out of sight of the neighbors. When I reached the front door, I took from my pocket the spare key Preston had pressed on me months earlier, along with a grand little speech about how his home was always mine. It had been a hollow gesture at the time. Today, it was the most useful thing he had ever given me. The lock turned with a soft click, and I stepped inside and shut the heavy door behind me. The house smelled of expensive vanilla. I stood a moment in the silent foyer, and something turned over in my chest that I had not expected. I had changed this boy's diapers. I had taught him to read music at the kitchen table. And here I was, an old man, letting myself into his home like a thief, because the only way left to protect one of my children was to hunt down the crimes of the other. I did not linger on the feeling. I walked straight down the hall to Preston's private study and pushed open the double doors. The room was a monument to money he had not earned. A great slab of a desk, leather chairs, shelves lined with business books whose spines had never once been cracked. I was looking for one thing: the cheap black phone I had watched him scrub clean in the driveway. A man does not carry a phone like that into a champagne tasting with a demanding bride. He leaves it somewhere he believes no one will ever think to look. I started with the obvious places. I went through the desk drawers one by one, sorting past files and blank stationery. Nothing. I ran my hands behind the rows of unread books. Nothing. I checked the pockets of the spare jackets hanging in his closet, the undersides of the chairs, the backs of the framed prints. Nothing at all. The minutes were slipping away, and my window was closing, and I stood in the center of that room and made myself stop. I glanced at my watch. The tasting had begun 40 minutes ago, and I did not know how long these things ran. Every drawer I opened and closed too loudly. Every board that creaked beneath the carpet sent a cold prickle up the back of my neck. A younger man might have torn the room apart, but I have spent my life learning that a thing hidden with care is found only with greater care, and that haste is how you miss the very seam you are searching for. I closed my eyes and did the thing I have done 10,000 times at my bench when a hidden repair refuses to show itself. I stopped looking with my eyes and started thinking like the maker. Where does a frightened, unoriginal man hide the one thing that could destroy him? Not in the drawer. In the place the drawer does not show you. I knelt on the carpet and slid myself beneath the knee-hole of the great desk. I reached up into the dark and ran my fingers along the rough, unfinished underside of the central drawer, and there they snagged on a strip of heavy tape. My heart gave one hard knock against my ribs. I peeled it back slowly, and a small black rectangle dropped into my palm. I slid out from under the desk and held the thing up to the light. Cheap, weightless, anonymous. I pressed the button on its side, and the screen woke with a dull glow demanding 4 digits. I knew my son. For all his polished arrogance, Preston had always been a creature of habit, sentimental in the laziest way. I tried his birth year. Wrong. I tried Sloane's. Wrong. I tried the day they had bought the house. A small warning flashed. 2 attempts remained before the phone locked itself forever. I made myself breathe. I thought back, past the man in the driveway, to the boy on the workshop bench, and I remembered the dog. A golden retriever we had brought home when Preston was 10 years old, the great love of his childhood. He had named the dog Coda, after the musical term, because I had just taught him what it meant, the little passage that brings a piece of music to its end. I looked at the keypad and found the letters. 2, 6, 3, 2. I entered them, and the lock shattered and the screen opened. My hands were perfectly steady as I searched. There were no messages, no names, no history. He had wiped the visible phone clean, exactly as I had watched him do. But panic makes even careful men careless, and my son, in his fear, had cleared the text threads and forgotten one thing entirely. He had never emptied the folder of deleted voicemails. And resting there, recovered and waiting, was a single audio file received just 2 days before. I raised the small speaker to my ear and pressed play. Sloane's voice filled that silent study, and it was nothing like the trembling, tearful voice from the driveway. It was sharp and clipped and impatient, the voice of a woman giving orders she expected to be obeyed. She told Preston to stop stalling and get the doctor to put the terminal prognosis in writing. She said that if the old woman did not pass before the wedding, they would lose the only window they had, because the grieving family's story was the one lever that would make his father sign the building over into the joint trust without reading every line. She said the appraisal was already done, and I understood coldly that this was where her fine art credentials had truly been spent. Not on clients and galleries, but on putting a number to the one thing of mine worth stealing. She said the paperwork was ready and waiting. And then before the message ended, she said one more thing in a lower and colder tone that lodged itself in me like a splinter. "Do not lose your nerve now," she said. "You are the one who knows where he keeps everything. This was your idea before it was ever mine." The recording clicked off. The room was very quiet. I stood there with the cheap phone against my ear, long after the sound had died. And two things settled into me at once. The first was the shape of what they truly wanted. This was never only about inheriting my money after Lorraine was gone. They were reaching for something specific, something they called the building. And they were reaching for it now, while I was distracted by grief. Before I could understand what was slipping through my fingers, the second thing was worse, and it turned my stomach in a way the poison never had. This was your idea before it was ever mine. I had spent all day building a picture in which my son was a weak, frightened boy, led by the hand into ruin by a cold and clever woman. But that was not what her voice said. Her voice said that the plan had begun with him, that the architecture of it, the knowing where I kept everything, the access, the timing, all of it had started in the mind of the child I had taught to hear an honest note. I did not know in that moment which of them to believe. Part of me had been clinging, without admitting it, to a small mercy, the idea that my boy had been swept up in something bigger than himself, that somewhere, under the greed, there was still a son who could be pulled back from the edge. Her voice took even that from me. Perhaps she was lying to flatter him the way a handler flatters a useful man. Or perhaps she was simply telling the truth, and the rot had begun in him after all. And if you have ever discovered that someone you raised and loved might be the author of the very cruelty you had comfortably blamed on a stranger, then you understand exactly why I had to sit down on the edge of that leather chair and simply breathe for a long moment before I could trust my legs to move again. I made myself set the doubt aside. Doubt could wait, evidence could not, because the voicemail had told me one more thing plainly, and it was the most frightening of all. This was not a wound already inflicted, a theft I had arrived too late to stop. It was a plan still in motion, with a clock running down toward the wedding. Every day my wife stayed alive was to them a day the scheme remained incomplete, which meant that so long as I played the grieving fool, the poison would keep coming and the paperwork would keep advancing, and the moment I stopped playing, they would move faster. I was not investigating a crime. I had walked into the middle of one. And the only advantage I held was that the criminals did not yet know it. I pressed the phone carefully back against the underside of the drawer, smoothing the tape down until it lay exactly as I had found it. I ran my palm across the carpet where I had knelt, erasing the marks of my weight. I straightened the chair. I left that study looking precisely as untouched as it had been when I walked in, because the whole of my plan now depended on two people who believed they had gotten away with everything. And I would not give them the smallest reason to look over their shoulders. I let myself out the front door, locked it, and walked back through the cooling afternoon to my car 2 blocks away. My hands, I noticed, had finally begun to tremble just slightly, and I gripped the wheel until they stopped. The building. Those 2 words rang in my head the whole way down the hill. They did not know what that building was to me. To them, it was a line on an appraisal, an asset to be moved. To me, it was the work of a lifetime. More than 30 years ago, long before this district filled with galleries and coffee bars, I had bought a rundown brick warehouse on the cheap, and I had spent a decade rebuilding it with my own 2 hands into the workshop where I had restored 1,000 instruments. It was more than a place I worked. It was the ground beneath my retirement, the quiet, steady thing that meant Lorraine would always have the finest care I could buy, no matter how long her fight went on. I had placed it years ago into a trust so carefully written that it could not be sold, borrowed against, or moved without my own signature in person, in ink. Every board in that place carried a memory. The corner where Lorraine used to sit on Saturdays with her coffee while I worked. The long bench where 100 ruined pianos had been made whole again. I had built it to be a fortress in law as much as in brick. And Sloane's voice had spoken of it as though the walls were already down, as though the deed were as good as signed. That was when the cold, clear certainty came over me that this was no longer a matter I could untangle alone with a spare key and a folded report. If they had found a way to reach the one thing I had made untouchable, then the danger was far larger than a stolen car or a poisoned cup. I needed a mind as ruthless and precise as their scheme, someone who understood the machinery of contracts and trusts the way I understood the grain of old spruce. I needed to see Callum Reyes, my attorney of 30 years. And I needed to see him now. Callum Reyes had protected my interests for 3 decades, and in all that time, I had never once seen him surprised. He was a lean, silver-haired man with pale, unhurried eyes. The kind of lawyer who reads a hostile contract the way I read a cracked soundboard. Slowly, and without ever letting his face show what he has found. He looked up from his desk when I walked in unannounced, and whatever he saw in my expression made him set down his pen at once. I closed his heavy door. I sat across from him and I did not soften it. I told him I believed my son and the woman Preston meant to marry were maneuvering to strip me of my property, and I needed him to pull the county records on the workshop building and the trust that held it immediately. Callum did not waste breath on questions. He turned to his screen and logged into the county recorder's database, and for a few minutes, the only sound in that quiet office was the steady click of his mouse. I watched his face the way I had watched Ingrid's outside the laboratory. I have learned to read the exact moment a careful man finds something he did not expect. It came about 5 minutes in. His jaw tightened. He leaned toward the monitor and read a document line by line, and the color drained slowly out of his cheeks. He stopped clicking. He took off his glasses, and he looked across the desk at me with an expression I had never seen him wear in 30 years. He asked me carefully whether I had walked into any lending office in the past 90 days to authorize a loan against my commercial property. I told him I had not set foot in one in over 5 years. He turned the wide monitor to face me and pointed at the screen. It was a commercial deed of trust, stamped and notarized by a county official just 3 weeks earlier. I leaned in and read the dense legal print, and my heart began to slam against my ribs as the meaning of it took shape. Someone had pledged my workshop, the brick building I had rebuilt, board by board, as collateral for a loan. A high-interest loan taken out against 30 years of my life. The amount borrowed against it was $2,500,000. And then my eyes fell to the bottom of the final page, to the line above my printed name. and the room went very cold and very still. There was my signature. I want you to understand what that meant to a man like me. I have spent 50 years training my eyes and my hands to know a false mark from a true one. I have saved auction houses from disaster and sent forgers home empty-handed on the strength of a single wrong angle, one hesitation in a line that should have flowed. And now I sat staring at a forgery of my own name, and it was good. It was very good. Whoever had made it understood the pressure of my hand, the particular loop I close on the second letter, the small habitual lift at the end, I have never once thought about. It was the work of someone who had studied me, someone who had sat at my own kitchen table, watching an old man sign checks and cards and letters, learning the shape of my honesty in order to counterfeit it. There was a cruelty in it that went deeper than the money. All my life, my name at the bottom of a document had meant something. It meant I had examined the thing above it and found it true. It was the one signature in 100 auctions that buyers trusted without a second reading. And they had taken that, the very trust I had spent a lifetime earning, and forged it into the instrument of my own undoing. The forger's art turned back upon the man who had spent his life defeating it. For the first time in this entire ordeal, my steady hands were not steady. I set them flat on the desk to still them. Callum let me look for a long moment, and then he pointed to the disbursement details. The $2.5 million had not gone into any account belonging to Preston. It had been wired instead into an obscure holding company, a shell registered only weeks before. He clicked to another record, the state business filing for that company, and he highlighted the name of its sole managing director, Sloane. There it was, in plain black type. And I understood in a single cold breath how it had all been possible. A forger this good does not work from a distance. To copy my hand so perfectly, she had needed samples, many of them gathered over months. To pledge a building locked inside an ironclad trust, she had needed to know precisely where the deed was kept and how the trust was worded. She had needed a key to the inside of my life. And there was only one person who had ever held that key. The same person the voicemail said had started it all. My son's bride had forged my signature to pull $2.5 million in cash out of the one asset I had built to be untouchable. And she had funneled it into a company that answered to no one but her. The full and terrible design of it settled over me at last. They were not simply waiting for Lorraine to die so they might inherit what was mine. They were bleeding me dry right now in the present, draining the ground from beneath my retirement, while they poisoned my wife by the cupful to make certain she would not live long enough to see any of it exposed. The stolen car had never been the crime. It had been a distraction, a small bright thing to catch my anger, while the real theft moved quietly through the county records. They believed I was a soft, grieving old man who would fade into the background of his own ruin. Looking at that flawless forgery of my name, I felt whatever grief remained in me burn away entirely, leaving something clean and cold and absolute in its place. Callum was already reaching for his phone. He said the word forgery aloud, and then federal, and he told me he was calling his contact at the Bureau this very minute. That bank fraud and forged collateral on this scale were serious federal crimes, that we needed agents and frozen accounts before those two could move the money offshore. I raised one hand and told him to stop. He froze the phone halfway to his ear and looked at me as though I had lost my mind. I looked at Callum across that wide desk, and I explained myself slowly so that he would understand this was not the confusion of a broken old man, but a decision. If federal agents knocked on their door today, I said I already knew exactly how it would go. Sloane would weep. She would play the frightened victim, hire a brilliant defense with the very money she had stolen, and swear that some rogue mortgage broker had handled all the paperwork without her knowledge. Preston would claim we had a spoken agreement that I had told him to look after my affairs, and he would twist my willingness to buy his mother a home into a vague blessing for a $2.5 million loan. Their lawyers would delay and obscure and point fingers. They would drag Lorraine in whatever days she had left, through months of depositions and hearings. And in the end, likely as not, they would settle quietly, protect their names, keep their freedom, and walk away wearing the same smiles. I did not want a long, ugly fight I might lose on a technicality. I wanted something else entirely. I wanted a trap so complete and so precise that they would not even feel the jaws close until it was far too late to run. Callum lowered the phone. He set it back in its cradle and sat looking at me for a long moment, and something shifted in his face, a recognition. He had known me 30 years. He had watched me quietly dismantle competitors who thought an old craftsman would be easy to push aside. He knew the flat, level tone in my voice because it was the same one I used when I had already decided to win. He steepled his fingers and asked me simply what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to take hold of their financial throats without waiting on the slow mercy of the federal courts. I asked him whether there was a legal way to do it. He was quiet for a while. He tapped his pen against a legal pad, and I could almost hear that sharp mind moving through the machinery of the law. And then a slow, dark smile began at the corner of his mouth, the first I had seen from him all afternoon. He leaned forward and asked me how much cash I could reach quickly outside of the family trusts. I told him I had a great deal more than $2.5 million in secure reserves, savings from a lifetime of steady work. He nodded, and he laid out a plan as elegant as it was merciless. Commercial loans, he explained, are not like the mortgage on a family home. They are bought and sold. A bank that originates a large commercial note often has no wish to carry the long risk of it. It collects its fees, and then it sells the debt onward to a private fund, an investor, whoever, will take it in order to clear the loan off its books. The paper changes hands all the time, quietly, as a matter of ordinary business. His proposal was simple and terrible. We would form a blind trust, an anonymous entity wrapped in so many layers of legal privacy that no one could ever see the hand behind it. Through that faceless trust, we would approach the bank that had issued the fraudulent loan, and we would offer to purchase the note and the deed of trust outright. We would offer a small premium over the balance, enough that the bank would sell at once, glad to be rid of the risk, and would ask no troublesome questions. Then Callum turned his screen toward me one more time, to a dense block of legal text buried deep in the loan agreement, and he set his finger on a single clause. The acceleration clause. He explained what it meant, and as he did, a cold and perfect clarity settled over me. Under the terms of that commercial note, if the holder of the debt ever discovered material fraud or forgery in the documents that created it, the entire loan fell instantly into default. Not a missed payment, not a warning. The whole balance, every dollar of the $2.5 million plus penalties and interest became due at once, payable within 24 hours. And if the borrower could not produce the cash in that single day, the holder of the note had the absolute right to seize the pledged property, freeze the connected accounts, and hand the forged documents straight to federal prosecutors. The beauty of it, the terrible poetry of it, settled into my chest and would not leave. They had forged my name to steal from what they believed was a vast faceless bank, an institution that might take months or years to notice a false signature buried in its archives. They thought they had committed the perfect invisible crime. They had no idea that within a day or two, the anonymous entity holding the power to end their lives entirely would not be a bank at all. It would be me. The man they were poisoning and robbing would quietly become the sole owner of their fraud. The one hand that could pull the whole thing tight whenever he chose. I sat with that for a moment, and I will be honest with you, because there is no point telling this story otherwise. Some part of me hesitated. I have spent my whole life on the side of the true thing, the honest joint, the genuine article. And here I was about to slip into the shadows myself, to hide behind faceless trusts and offshore walls, to become a silent creditor waiting in the dark. It did not feel like justice exactly. It felt colder than that. But then I thought of Lorraine humming her Sunday song with a needle in her hand, and of the cup they poured for her each morning with a prayer on their lips. And whatever hesitation I had went quiet. I told Callum to begin at once, drain the reserve accounts, build the trust in whatever jurisdiction hid it most completely. Buy the paper, whatever premium it cost, whatever fees the speed demanded. I did not care about the money. I wanted to own that debt. He was already typing, drafting the first frameworks, his fingers quick across the keys. He worked for a moment, then paused and looked up at me, and he asked the only question that remained. When did I want to serve them? The demand. I stood and I looked out his window at the mountains going blue in the fading light, and I felt a calm settle over me, deeper than any I had known in weeks. When they have the largest audience possible, I said, I would let them keep their car and their secrets and their smiles a little longer. I would let them climb all the way to the top of their own arrogance, believing they had won. And only then, when the whole world was watching, would I let them fall. For 2 days, the plan moved in the dark. Callum built his faceless trust, drained the reserves, and opened his quiet conversation with the bank. I kept up my part, the tired and grateful father, and I waited. And then, on the third evening, my old friend Ford Whitaker called me, and without knowing it, he handed me the last and sharpest piece of the whole design. Ford is an auctioneer of fine instruments, a man who has spent 40 years the way I have, chasing the genuine article across the country. He called to catch up and to boast a little, the way we do. There was a rare thing on the private market, he said, an unlisted sale, very discreet. A century-old concert grand, beautifully restored, of a maker so uncommon that only a handful exist. A quiet buyer was being sought. No auction, no records, no fuss. I stood very still in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, because he had just described, down to the maker and the year, the piano I gave my wife on the day we married. I told Ford I would call him back. I set the phone down, and I walked into the front room of my own house where that piano has stood for 40 years. And I looked at it. It was there. Of course it was there. It sat exactly where it always sat, its lid gleaming, its lines as familiar to me as Lorraine's own face. For a moment I felt foolish, an old man frightened by a coincidence. Pianos of that kind are rare, but they are not unique. Somewhere out there, another one could easily be changing hands. But I did not build my life on somewhere, and could easily. I built it on proof. I lifted the lid and propped it, and I leaned in over the strings, and I did the thing I have done to 10,000 instruments, and never once to this one, because I had never needed to. On the soundboard of every piano I have ever restored, in a place no ordinary eye would find, I carve a small mark and a date, my own private signature, the honest note at the bottom of my work. I had signed this one myself, half a century ago, with my hands still young. The mark was there, and it was wrong. It was close. It was frighteningly close. The right shape in the right place, carved by someone who had clearly seen the original and copied it with care. But I have made that mark 10,000 times. I know the exact depth of my own cut, the small habitual drag at the end of the stroke, the way I have always tailed it off, the same lift that lives in my forged signature at the bottom of that loan. This was not my hand. It was an excellent copy of my hand. But a carved mark can be studied and copied by a patient hand. There was one thing that could not. I sat down on the bench the way I had sat 10,000 evenings while Lorraine played, and I pressed a single chord and let it ring out into the quiet room. Every instrument has a voice as particular as a fingerprint shaped by its wood and its age and the 10,000 small choices of the man who rebuilt it. I know the voice of this piano the way I know my wife's. I had even kept a recording of it years ago, the way I keep a record of every piece I restore. and the sound that rose from these strings was beautiful and rich and utterly, unmistakably wrong. It was another piano's voice wearing my piano's face. I straightened up slowly, and I rested one palm on the cool black wood, and I understood. The piano in front of me was not the piano I married my wife beside. The real one, the true one, the instrument I had rebuilt string by string and given to Lorraine as the one treasure I owned, had been quietly sold months ago into that discreet private market Ford had just described. And in its place, in my own front room, they had set a copy, good enough that a grieving old man would walk past it every single day and never know his heart had been robbed, along with his bank accounts. I want you to understand what that did to me standing there. They had not only stolen my money and poisoned my wife, they had reached into the very center of our marriage, into the object that held 40 years of Sunday evenings, and they had sold it like scrap and replaced it with a lie, betting that I would be too broken to hear the difference. I could still see her on the day I gave it to her, 40 years gone, laughing as she sat down in her wedding dress and played the first thing that came into her head, filling that little rented hall with music while our families clapped. Every note she had played since had lived somewhere in that wood, and they had carted it off to a stranger for cash the way you sell a used appliance, and they had not even flinched. A fake family gathered around a fake instrument. The symmetry of it was almost unbearable. And then standing over that beautiful counterfeit, the cold clarity returned, because I saw at last how the whole thing tied together. Sloane, my son's clever bride, had done more than steal. She had spent weeks arranging a lavish charity gala, an evening built to launder her image before the wealthy people whose trust she needed, folded conveniently into the celebration of her wedding. And the crowning jewel of that evening, the piece she meant to display and to have played on that stage before 300 admiring guests, was the famous family heirloom. Except the famous family heirloom was gone. What they would wheel onto that stage under the lights in front of everyone who mattered to her was this copy. They had no idea what they were doing. In their greed, they had chosen to place a forgery at the exact center of the most public night of their lives and to hand the microphone to the crowd. And they had forgotten the one thing about the old man they were robbing, that he had spent 50 years learning to tell what is real from what is fake, and that he could do it, if he chose, out loud, with his own ears, in a single, unforgettable moment. I picked up the phone and called Ford back, and I asked him one quiet question. Could he find out discreetly exactly when that piano had left my house and who had signed for it? Then I looked at the copy gleaming in the lamplight, and for the first time in many days, something close to a smile touched my face. They were going to put that fake on the stage in front of the whole world. It was perfect. The most dangerous enemy in the world is the one who has convinced you he is already surrendered. So I set out to surrender completely and convincingly over a home-cooked meal. I called Preston the next evening. When he answered, his voice was guarded, braced for another argument about the car. Instead, I gave him a tired, trembling old man with no fight left. I apologized for my harsh words in the driveway. I told him his mother was failing fast, that the doctors were out of answers, and that the grief had made me irrational and unkind. I asked humbly whether he and Sloane would come to the house for dinner so I could make amends while we still had time as a family. He exhaled with obvious relief and said, "Of course." I could hear the smile creep back into his voice, the patient, patronizing tone of a son who believes he is once again in control. I will tell you that the performance cost me more than any of the rest of it. It is one thing to be robbed. It is another to sit across from the people who robbed you and beg in the trembling voice of a beaten man for their forgiveness. I am a proud man. I have never in my life pretended to be smaller than I am. But pride is a thing you can set down for a while if the reason is large enough, and my reason was lying in a hospital bed across town, humming to keep her own fear company. For her. I could play the fool as long as it took. I spent the afternoon roasting a chicken and setting the table with Lorraine's good plates, the ones she had chosen 40 years ago. When the doorbell rang, I let my shoulders sag and opened the door to find the two of them on my porch. Sloane, in a soft white dress, holding a small bouquet of lilies. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around my neck and murmured how heavily my pain weighed on her heart. Her perfume was overpowering. I made myself return the embrace with the clumsy warmth of a grateful, clueless old man. We sat down to eat. I kept my hands unsteady on purpose, fumbling the serving spoon, letting them see a man coming apart. Throughout the meal, I steered the conversation to Lorraine, to her weakness, to my terrible fear that the end was near. I watched them perform their sympathy. Preston nodded at his plate with manufactured grief. Sloane reached across the table and laid her hand over mine and told me gently that we had to be strong, that Lorraine would want us to celebrate life, and that their wedding would bring a ray of light into this dark season. I nodded and I withdrew my hand, and I reached into the pocket of my cardigan. I told them that thinking about their wedding had made me realize how foolishly I had behaved. I said that in my grief, I had lost sight of the future, that I had been wrong to question Preston's judgment about the car, that of course, a woman in Sloane's new position needed to project success. I watched the last of the tension drain from my son's shoulders. He actually leaned back in his chair and took a long, satisfied sip of his wine. Then I drew out a folded slip of paper and smoothed it flat on the table. It was a cashier's check drawn on one of my personal accounts, made out to Sloane Merrick. The amount written across it was $150,000. I slid it across the table toward her. I told her I wanted to replace the money Preston had borrowed, that this was my wedding gift to them both, a gesture of complete faith in their new life together. I said I wanted her to use it for the catering, the flowers, every detail she had dreamed of. I looked at her with wide, trusting, watery eyes and said I only wanted to see my family happy before the darkness took my wife. The check was bait, and I knew exactly what it would do. A greedy hand cannot refuse a gift, even a suspicious one. And every dollar I gave them now would sink them deeper into the comfortable certainty that they had won, that the old man was tamed, that there was nothing left to fear. The more I gave, the less they would watch. That was all I wanted. I wanted them to stop watching. For one single second before she could stop it, the mask slipped. I have watched 1,000 faces the instant they see a thing they want badly and believe they can have. Sloane's eyes widened, and something raw and hungry moved across them, the look of a predator that has spotted an exposed throat. It lasted no longer than a heartbeat. Then the devoted daughter-in-law returned her hand flying to her chest, a soft gasp of disbelief on her lips. She rose, rushed around the table, and threw her arms around me, thanking me over and over, swearing this generous gift would make their wedding the most beautiful day of their lives. She folded the check with delicate, possessive fingers and slipped it into her handbag. She sat back down beside Preston, who gave me a lazy, victorious smile and told me I had done the right thing, that everything was going to be perfectly fine. I nodded and kept my face soft and grateful, and stood to gather the empty plates. I turned my back on them and moved slowly toward the kitchen, shuffling my feet, playing the drained old man to the last. I was barely 5 steps away, half in the shadow of the doorway, when Sloane leaned toward my son. She believed I was out of earshot. She believed I was too lost in my own sorrow to notice anything at all. But the house was quiet, and my hearing, whatever else had failed in me, has always been perfect. Her voice dropped to a low, satisfied whisper, barely more than a breath, and every syllable of it carried across that silent room with terrible clarity. The old fool, she said, was too distracted by his dying wife to ever notice the workshop was already gone. I did not stop walking. I did not let the plates so much as rattle in my hands. I carried them into the kitchen, set them gently in the sink, and stood there for a moment with the water running over my fingers, feeling a cold and total calm settle into my bones. She had just confessed. In her arrogance at my own table, over my own wife's plates, she had handed me the last piece I needed. The trap was built, the jaws were open, and she had just stepped smiling directly onto the trigger. 2 weeks before the wedding, Sloane insisted that Lorraine attend the final bridal fitting. She framed it as a loving gesture, a way to honor her future mother-in-law, and it made her look to all her friends like an angel. It was a beautiful lie, and my wife, who wanted only peace and the sight of her son happy, agreed to go. She spent an hour that morning arranging her wig and putting a little color in her pale cheeks, trying her best to look well for a celebration she was barely strong enough to attend. I drove us to the boutique and settled her gently into her folding wheelchair. Inside, all mirrors and crystal and the smell of orchids, Sloane stood on a raised platform draped in lace, surrounded by her bridesmaids. When she saw the wheelchair, the bright smile she wore for her friends faltered for just an instant, and her eyes narrowed with a flicker of pure irritation. She gestured to an assistant and said in a carrying whisper that the chair was ruining the light for the photographer she had hired. She had us moved into a dim corner beside a rack of heavy curtains, out of the way, like an inconvenient piece of luggage. Lorraine folded her thin hands in her lap and kept her eyes on the floor and pretended she had not heard. For the next hour, my wife was a stage prop. Whenever the photographer wanted a tender family moment, Sloane would rush over, crouch beside the wheelchair, rest her chin on Lorraine's frail shoulder, and beam. The instant the shutter clicked, the smile vanished, and she walked away without a word. Preston arrived halfway through, carrying iced coffees for the bridesmaids, and handed them around without once looking at his mother. The worst of it came when Lorraine, trying to be part of the moment, offered a soft, genuine compliment about how lovely the lace looked. Sloane turned, and her face hardened, and she did not say thank you. She let out a sharp sigh loud enough for the whole room, and complained that the dark color of the wig clashed with the theme of her photographs, that such a sickly, depressing thing in the background was going to ruin the images she had worked so hard to create. A heavy silence fell over the room. The bridesmaids exchanged glances, and a few of them hid small, cruel smiles behind their glasses. Lorraine shrank back into the wheelchair and pulled her cardigan tighter, trying to make herself smaller to disappear. A single tear tracked down her pale cheek. She said nothing in her own defense. She simply lowered her head and accepted it to keep the peace for her son. I stood 10 feet away, leaning against a display table, and I did not move. 2 weeks earlier, I would have thrown that table across the room. Today I kept my face slack and vacant, the tired old man too weary to intervene. But my hands were not idle. Deep in my coat pocket, my fingers were curled around my phone, its lens angled through a small gap in the fabric, its recorder running. I was capturing every word, every sneer, every cruel little smile, every tear my wife shed. When the time came, no lawyer on earth would be able to call it a misunderstanding. But the true revelation of that afternoon was not Sloane's cruelty. I had long since stopped being surprised by that. It was Preston. I turned my gaze from my weeping wife to my son, and I watched him carefully, because I had carried a doubt for 2 weeks. The voicemail had said the plan began with him, and for a moment I had feared that the architect of all this was not the cold stranger, but my own boy. Watching him now, I finally knew the truth, and it was worse in a different way. Preston had heard every word. He had seen his mother shrink in shame, seen the tear on her face, and for one flickering second, I saw something cross his features: discomfort, guilt, the ghost of the boy who had once pressed his ear to a piano to hear what was honest. He knew it was wrong. He knew it was monstrous. And then, Instead of stepping forward, instead of defending the woman who had given him life, he turned his head away and stared at a rack of gowns. There it was. That was my answer. Sloane was the architect, cold and deliberate and in command of every detail. Preston was not her equal partner and never had been. He was her instrument, weak and frightened and useful, a man who had handed her the keys to my life, not out of genius, but out of cowardice, and who would now stand silent and let his mother be tormented rather than risk the comfort he had stolen. The voicemail had been Sloane rewriting history in his ear, teaching him to believe the cruelty was his idea, so he could never turn back. I felt something break inside me then, quietly and permanently. Whatever last thread of hope I had held that my son might be saved, that under the greed there was still a boy worth reaching, snapped and fell away. He was not a victim. He was a coward who had chosen his stolen comfort over his own dying mother, again and again, in full view of both of us. There is no grief quite like burying a child who is still breathing. I had raised him, taught him, paid for every door that opened in his life, and I had done it gladly, believing I was building a good man. To stand in that bright room and understand that the good man had never finished forming, that somewhere along the way he had traded his spine for a comfortable life, was a loss I felt in my chest like a physical weight. But I did not let it slow me. Grief that cannot save anyone is only a burden. And I had work to do. I wheeled Lorraine out of that boutique with as much gentleness as I could manage. Preston did not follow. He did not help his mother into the car. He stayed behind in the shallow world he had chosen over his own blood. In the car, Lorraine was quiet, her head against the window, and after a while she reached over and patted my hand, as if I were the one who needed comforting. She always could tell when something in me had gone still and cold, even when she did not know why. I did not tell her. Not yet. I only drove her home through the golden afternoon and promised myself that she would never sit in a corner again. I got Lorraine home and into the care of her nurses, and then I drove to the far end of a quiet parking lot where a black sedan sat beneath a single lamp. The window rolled down. Callum Reyes looked out at me, his face carved from stone. He did not waste a word. The blind trust was complete, he said. The debt was bought. I was now the sole holder of the note, and the acceleration clause was armed. He had met quietly with his contacts at the bureau. The forged documents had been reviewed. Warrants were signed, and agents were on standby waiting for one thing only. My signal. Everything was in place. The trap was set. All that remained was to choose the moment, and I already knew exactly when it would be. The gala was everything Sloane had dreamed. A grand ballroom, 300 guests in silk and jewels, ice sculptures and walls of white roses, all of it paid for with my stolen life. On a raised stage at the front, beneath the chandeliers, stood the piano, the counterfeit, her crowning jewel. I wheeled Lorraine in through the tall doors and parked her near the head table, and I took my seat beside her, the folded envelope resting quietly against my heart. For an hour I watched Sloane reign over the room, loud and gleaming and certain, snapping at waiters drinking too much, drunk on champagne and on the belief that she had won. Preston sat sweating in his tailored suit, draining one glass of bourbon after another, unable to meet my eyes. He looked like a man waiting for a trap door to open beneath him. He was right to. When the speeches began, Sloane took the microphone before anyone could stop her. She thanked her wealthy friends. She spoke of her brilliant future, her grand plans, her exquisite taste. And then her voice curdled the champagne, loosening the cruelty underneath. She said that weddings were about looking forward, not back. She said, staring straight at our table, that some people simply had to learn when their time was over to step aside and hand the future to those who truly deserved it. A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the crowd. I did not frown. I raised my water glass to her in a small gesture of surrender, and I took a slow sip. The beaten old fool to the very last. She was not satisfied with words. She wanted a spectacle. She set down the microphone, crossed to where my wife sat, and before anyone understood what was happening, she reached down and pulled the wig from Lorraine's head. The room froze. Under the full glare of the chandeliers, my wife sat, exposed, her bare scalp pale and marked by everything the treatments had taken from her. For one endless second, the ballroom held its breath. And then, from among the bridesmaids came the soft, cruel sound of laughter. I have already told you what I did next. I rose. I did not shout or curse. I unbuttoned my jacket, slipped it from my shoulders, and stepped between the blinding light and my wife. And I draped the dark cloth gently over her head and shoulders, shielding her from every staring eye. I smoothed it around her and whispered that she was safe now, that it was almost over. She gripped the fabric and pressed her face into it. Then I straightened and I walked to the piano and I laid the single white envelope on its gleaming lid, and I looked into Sloane's triumphant eyes and asked her very gently to open it. She snatched it up, certain it was the deed, the last surrender of the beaten old man. She tore it open in front of everyone, and I watched her face change as her eyes found the heavy black letters at the top of the page. Notice of acceleration. Demand for payment in full. $2,500,000. The color drained from her. The mocking smile fell away. The pages trembled in her hands as she read the clauses, the seizure of assets, the frozen accounts, and at the bottom, the name of the anonymous trust that now held her fraudulent debt, and my own signature listed as its sole director. I picked up the microphone she had discarded. I did not raise my voice. I let it carry cold and clear across the silent room. You did not borrow from a bank, Sloane. You borrowed from me. And because you forged my signature to do it, the entire debt is due tonight. Right now. Gasps moved through the crowd. Phones came up, glowing recording. But I was not finished, and I turned now to the one thing only I could do. I sat down at the piano in front of 300 people, and I pressed a single chord. It rang out, rich and beautiful, into the frozen ballroom. Then I lifted my hands, and I told them the truth. I told them that this famous heirloom, the treasure at the heart of this glittering evening, was a fake, a forgery. That the real instrument, the one I built with my own hands and gave my wife 40 years ago, had been quietly sold months before, and this clever copy set in its place. I told them I had spent 50 years learning to tell what is real from what is counterfeit, and that I would stake my name here tonight on the fact that the piano they had come to admire was a lie, exactly like the marriage being celebrated on top of it. The room had gone utterly still. And into that silence I laid the last and darkest thing. I told them about the tonic, about the loving daughter-in-law who arrived each morning with a warm cup and a prayer, and about the laboratory report folded in my coat that proved what was truly in it. A poison brewed to strip the medicine from my dying wife's blood and hurry her toward the grave, so that these two could seize my estate before anyone thought to look. The reaction was a sound I will never forget. Cries of horror, men shouting. The wealthy, careful people whose trust Sloane had spent years courting now looked at her with open disgust. Her empire of appearances was burning to ash in front of her in a matter of seconds. She broke. She lunged forward, jabbing a finger at me, shrieking that I was a senile old man inventing lies to ruin her, demanding that security remove me, that I had no proof of anything. She was still screaming when the great doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a crash. Callum Reyes stood framed in the entrance, a thick briefcase in one hand. Flanking him, moving with swift and unmistakable authority, were 3 agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, their badges gleaming at their belts. They crossed the paralyzed room. The lead agent stepped onto the stage, stated Sloane's full name, and began to recite the charges: the forged loan, the wire fraud, the shell company, the seized property. She recoiled, screaming that they were making a terrible mistake, that she was a respected professional. 2 of them took her by the arms, and the sharp click of the handcuffs closing echoed through the silent hall, like the final closing of a vault. Seeing his bride restrained shattered whatever was left of Preston. He scrambled across the stage and threw himself onto his knees at my feet, sobbing, clutching at my trousers, begging me to stop them, pleading that we were family, that Sloane had manipulated him, that he was sorry. I looked down at him for a long moment, and I felt nothing at all. No warmth, no pity, only a cold and glacial calm. I told him quietly, so that he heard every word, that he had stood by while the woman he loved poisoned his own mother, that he had turned his head away and let her be humiliated for the sake of a stolen life. I told him that a man who could watch his mother suffer so for a house and a car was no longer any son of mine. He collapsed forward wailing, but I had already stepped around him. Behind me, the agents were leading Sloane down the long center aisle, her shrieks of rage echoing off the high ceilings as 300 guests scrambled for the exits, desperate to be far from the wreckage. The grand and glittering wedding had disintegrated into ruin. I turned my back on all of it. I walked to my wife, still wrapped in my jacket, still trembling, and I knelt beside her wheelchair and took her hands in mine. I told her softly that the nightmare was over, that no one would ever hurt her again. Then I stood and I gripped the handles of her chair and I wheeled her slowly out of that broken ballroom, through the overturned chairs and the scattered roses, and I did not once look back at the son weeping alone on the empty stage. The 3 months that followed felt less like the turning of a calendar and more like climbing out of a lightless cave into the warmth of a new morning. The aftermath of that ruined gala was swift and merciless and final. Sloane and Preston never saw the inside of a honeymoon suite. They were taken into federal custody that same night, and there they stayed, held without bail. The sheer scale of the fraud, joined to the evidence of what had been done to my wife, led the judge to name them both extreme flight risks. The unlisted mansion they had bought in the mountains with my stolen money, the jewelry, the pearl-white car they had paraded so proudly. All of it was seized by the government. Their glittering empire of lies collapsed into a pile of worthless ash. I severed my son from my life, completely and permanently. I removed his name from every inheritance document, cut every remaining legal tie, and made certain his shadow would never fall across our peace again. He had chosen his road of greed and cowardice, and now he would walk it entirely alone. The recovered money, all $2.5 million of it, came back into my hands as the fraudulent assets were liquidated. It did not return to some quiet retirement fund to sit and gather dust. It became instead the key to a miracle. We used it to enroll Lorraine in a new and remarkable immune cell therapy program at a Weeding Research Center. The very kind of treatment those 2 had pretended to care about while they poisoned her by the cupful. And now, unburdened at last by the tonic that had been quietly undoing her medicine every single morning, her fragile body finally had a real chance to fight. The change over those 90 days was nothing short of breathtaking. There was something else I did with a small part of that money, something that mattered to me more than I can easily explain. I called Ford, and I asked him to quietly track down the buyer of the real piano, the true one, the instrument I had built for my wife and they had sold like scrap. It took him 6 weeks. The collector who had it was a decent man who had bought it in good faith, and when he heard the whole story, he sold it back to me for exactly what he had paid. I brought it home in the back of a padded truck, and I set it back in the front room where it had stood for 40 years. And I carried the beautiful counterfeit out to the workshop, where it still sits, a reminder of how close a clever fake can come, and how it can never quite hold the true voice. There were nights in those first weeks when I lay awake and asked myself whether I had done a terrible thing. I had schemed in the dark. I had set a trap and let two people walk into it in front of the whole world, and I had felt no mercy while they fell. That is not the man I spent 72 years trying to be. But then I would rise and check on Lorraine and watch her sleep in peace without a stranger's cup waiting for her at dawn, and the question would quiet itself. Some things you do not do for your own soul. You do them because someone you love cannot do them for themselves. This morning the piano was the least of my reasons to give thanks. The crisp autumn breeze came down off the Blue Ridge and carried the sweet, unmistakable smell of wood smoke and turning leaves. Lorraine and I sat side by side on a weathered bench in the little park above the river, watching the light move on the water. The folding wheelchair that had confined her for so long was gone. She sat upright beside me, her posture holding a quiet, steady strength that had been absent for far too long. The dark hollows beneath her eyes had filled in with color. Her most recent scans confirmed what my own eyes could already see, that her cancer markers were falling at a speed her doctors called almost miraculous. I reached over and took her hand, marveling at the warmth returning to her fingers. And I looked at her head, deeply moved by the sight of her own hair coming back. A soft new crown of silver and chestnut where the harsh lights of that ballroom had once found her bare. She turned her face toward the morning sun and closed her eyes and took a deep, unhurried breath of the clean mountain air. A serene smile touched her lips, no longer weighed down by the fear and betrayal that had suffocated our home for the better part of a year. A pair of geese crossed the pale sky above the water, calling to each other, and she followed them with her eyes and laughed, a small, real laugh, the first I had heard from her in months. I had forgotten in all the darkness how much I had missed that sound. It is a strange thing about a long marriage. You can lose a fortune, a home, a son, and still find that the whole of your wealth was sitting beside you on a bench the entire time, laughing at a pair of geese. Last night, for the first time in longer than I can remember, she sat down at the true piano, the one that had come home, and she played her old Sunday song all the way through. Her hands were still weak, and she missed a note here and there, and it was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. I stood in the doorway, and I wept quietly, the way an old man weeps when something he thought was lost forever is placed gently back into his hands. We had cut the rot out of our family tree just in time. The greed and the cruelty that Preston and Sloane brought into our lives had been removed entirely, and what remained behind was a deep and unbreakable peace. We lost a son to the endless hunger for wealth and status, but in that painful, necessary severing, we reclaimed our own lives. Sitting there on that bench, my wife's warm hand in mine, watching the golden light dance across the moving water, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not triumph, not even relief. Something quieter and far larger than either. I felt for the first time in a year that we were going to be all right. And I found myself thinking about everything that had happened, everything I had learned, and about the one lesson I most wanted to leave behind for anyone who has ever been made to feel that love requires them to endure being harmed. Here is what I learned and what I would give to anyone still trapped in a house where love has been twisted into a leash. Love was never meant to be a debt you pay with your own suffering. Sharing someone's blood does not give them the right to rob you, to shame you, or to harm the people you cherish. For too long, I mistook silence for peace and endurance for loyalty. And that mistake nearly cost me the woman I love most in this world. Real family does not ask you to make yourself smaller so that it can grow. It is not weakness to draw a line and say, this far and no further. Sometimes the most loving thing a person can do for themselves and for everyone they protect is to cut the rot from the tree so the rest of it may live. And always, always trust the quiet voice inside you that knows the true from the fake. I do not know how Lorraine and I were given this second morning together, but I thank God for every hour of it. I thank God for the steady hands He let me keep, and for placing the right friends in my path exactly when I needed them. And when I watch my wife lift her face to the sun, I know that whatever grace carried us through that darkness was a gift from God, and I will spend the rest of my days grateful for it. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like it and subscribe so more people can find it. And I would truly love to hear from you. So tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you sit. If you have ever found the courage to walk away from family who treated you as less than you deserved, share your story below. I read every single one. You were never as alone as they tried to make you feel.